Assalamu alaikum. Suleiman Rahim here. Welcome. It's currently May 11th, 2021. Temperatures rising near the boiling point. Wars on the horizon within 60 days. That's my interpretation of the angel. War within 60 days. Could break out any day now. Maybe witnessing the first stages. Listen.
In Israel that we've got to go back to. Thanks for joining us, though. Appreciate it. Let's go back to Trey Ames. Trey, what are you seeing there?
John, rocket fire right now into southern Israel. I'm going to have my cameraman pan up. This is a massive barrage being fired from the northern part of the Gaza Strip into southern Israel. You are likely to see some of these interception rounds get fired off depending on how high and at what angle these rockets are being fired. Just listen here for a second because we're probably going to hear some explosions. I'm going to let you listen here. More sirens going off right now in southern Israel. And you can see that rockets are being fired from the northern part of the Gaza Strip. Still, this is earlier than the barrage that we talked about could happen from Islamic Jihad at 9. I'm going to have my cameraman pan back up. This is the scene that Israel has been dealing with over the past 24 hours. Sirens blaring across the southern and central part of the country. And there is an effort right now by the Israeli military to at least have some sort of structure so they can continue their operation in Gaza. We have seen videos from inside the Gaza Strip this evening that Hamas and Islamic Jihad say will require retaliation. One of those has to do with a 13-story building inside Gaza City that was hit with an Israeli airstrike just about an hour ago. And just give me a second here. I need to look up here. One second here. They're fired towards Tel Aviv. My producer's telling me right now that these rockets are being fired towards Tel Aviv. That 9 p.m. local time ultimatum that was put out by Islamic Jihad is no longer the case. Israel is currently under attack from Gaza, the second largest city in Israel. Tel Aviv, I can give you a little bit of context about this city. This is a place that is often referred to as a European city. It's got a big beach and a young population. It's not necessarily as religious as places like Jerusalem. And it's a city that often stays away from the politics and the conflict. We understand that right now it is under attack from these rockets, and Tel Aviv has sirens blaring, according to my producer that I'm talking to right now. I just want to have my cameraman pan to the skyline here so you can see off in the distance. Those smokestacks that you see are basically the dividing line between Israel and Gaza. When you think about the border and how close these two areas are, we are talking about just a matter of feet.
Trey, it's John. I want to ask you this question. You were in Sderot yesterday, which of course has been the subject of so many rocket attacks coming in from the Gaza Strip, and now that Hamas is targeting the capital, targeting Tel Aviv, which really is sort of the financial hub of Israel. Is that going to change Israel's response? I mean, couldn't we see all-out war break out here between Israel and Hamas?
Yes, these are the types of actions by groups inside Gaza that lead to war. We saw yesterday factions in Gaza threaten rocket fire on Jerusalem, an action that had not been taken since 2014 when a massive 50-plus day operation called Protective Edge, referred to by the Israelis as Sukatan, developed. There were casualties on both sides. We saw extremely tense days of fighting. I was here during that time and entered Gaza, and the amount of fighting was extremely significant. I want to show you the scene here. They are still firing. These are medium to long range rockets. I can tell you that just by looking at them. And another indication, John, is the interception rounds that would normally be coming out of the Iron Dome missile defense system right next to me are not firing off. This means there are other systems likely in central Israel that are going to pick up this fire from Gaza. These are going off in separate directions. This is a coordinated effort by factions inside Gaza to respond to the Israeli airstrikes tonight. We have seen this back and forth across the border today, all starting yesterday. I do want to give you a little bit of context about how we got here. There has been major tension erupting in this part of the world, specifically in the city of Jerusalem, over two issues. And you hear that explosion, that's a short-range interception round, likely around Sderot, like the area that we were talking about. We can hear that off in the distance. But we got here for two major reasons. One had to do with the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, a neighborhood in Jerusalem where Palestinian families could be evicted. The other one having to do with, I'm just going to make sure my crew's down here. Guys, make sure you're next to the car. Stay with me here, John. I just want to get us a little bit of cover in case. Walk with me. Walk with me. All right. Next to the car here. Basically, we are not near a shelter, but we are near interception rounds, Israel's missile defense system. We are okay, but we're just taking precautions here because you never know where these rockets are going to land, and oftentimes, even when they are intercepted, there is shrapnel coming down from the interception rounds. To get back to what we were talking about, though, John, two major issues. One having to do with a very specific neighborhood in Jerusalem. Another one having to do with the holy month of Ramadan. Tomorrow is Eid, the last day of Ramadan, the holiest month in Islam. And Muslims, Palestinians in Jerusalem were clashing with police this week at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. And that has led to a lot of the tension. All of these things happening together, along with political issues for both the Israelis and the Palestinians. It's all coming to a focal point right now, leading to a massive conflict that started out, as we said, with just demonstrations and clashes, and now the region is on the brink of war.
Trey, of course, we'd like you to stay with us on this breaking news. If you feel like you need to go to safety, do that right now. But I'll ask you what the response is that we're hearing from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at this time, knowing that he issued that video statement saying that Israel would step up its strikes on Gaza, and where he stands in this moment, if you've heard.
Earlier today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made a statement to the Israeli people. He was really addressing the population here, saying that if this rocket fire continues, there will be a severe Israeli response. And you can hear those explosions in the distance, which indicates Hamas and Islamic Jihad are not just firing towards Tel Aviv, but also towards central Israel and probably a lot of the border towns. But the Prime Minister wanted to make clear that this operation is just getting underway from his perspective. We spoke with a number of sources in the Israeli military today to try to get a better picture of what the Israeli military was preparing to do. Would they be moving in ground forces and troops? We know they called up 5,000 reserve members, but the Prime Minister is calling the shots here. Despite the political uncertainty in Israel, he is still in charge, along with his defense minister, Benny Gantz, and they say they are going to make Hamas pay a heavy price. And if today is any indication, there will be airstrikes against significant infrastructure inside Gaza. We've spent weeks, oftentimes during different conflicts in Gaza, and there is a lot of infrastructure where groups there are firing rockets. They're storing rockets. They're storing anti-tank missiles. But one other thing to note, and we have to talk about this amid this conflict, it's the civilian population in Gaza. There are nearly 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza. The vast majority of those people are not terrorists. They are not looking to kill Israeli civilians. They're looking to be human. They're looking to live their lives, and we've spent a lot of time talking to those people as well. And I think it's important to make this distinction while we cover this conflict and the rocket fire and the barrages towards massive Israeli population centers. This is a war, and a war is not fought by civilians, but oftentimes the consequences and the prices at the highest level are paid by those innocent bystanders. John,
Trey, in terms of the Israeli response, we've got about a minute left here. In terms of the Israeli response, so far we've seen airstrikes. Is there a possibility that, as we have seen in times past, that Israeli defense forces could go in on the ground to try to clear out these missile storage bunkers? I assume that most of the missiles are being fired from mobile launches, so those are difficult to go after, but maybe go after the infrastructure on the ground as opposed to simply from the air.
Absolutely, John. We talked earlier this year with Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz. We were sitting down with him in Tel Aviv at his office, talking about Gaza and what preparations were being made should a conflict like this erupt. We are in the midst of what that conversation focused on, and he said they were preparing for any possibility, and that could include a ground operation. What we're likely to see in the coming days, especially now that tonight factions in Gaza are firing on Tel Aviv, is preparation for just anything. John, Sandra.
Trey, thank you for your continued reporting from the border there. We will, of course, be checking back in with you shortly. Please stay safe. Thank you.
All right, and we'll take a short break, and we'll be back after this. Stay with us as you see another rocket there coming up over the southern part of Israel from Gaza, another barrage.
This past school year has been filled with ups and downs, and like most parents, you may be worried your child isn't on track for the fall. With the Becca Academy,
Yes, brothers and sisters, why is no one talking about it? Where's Farrakhan? Where's Silas? Where's Royal?
now it's the
They've
perfect
been living off the people for over 40 years. And now, as the pot's about to boil, crickets, silence, silence, silence. Because they don't do anything, they never knew anything, they're as blind as the people that's following them. Crickets, crickets, crickets. Nothing. Time of unprecedented trouble. And they have nothing to say. Silence. They're waiting like everyone else, hoping that nothing happens. They're going to continue sucking our people's blood. That's all they've ever done. That's all they ever will do. It's pathetic. So let's do a little more of this. Okay, here we go. Second here. So a little more of this, brothers and sisters. The blind leading the blind.
We are continuing to monitor for more rocket fire toward Israel from Gaza as the situation escalates in the Middle East. Let's just listen in here for a second as more rockets are being fired from Gaza towards central Israel. There you see the rockets coming up.
All right. Let's get back to Trey Yingst. As we just said, he is reporting live on the Israel-Gaza border for us. He's got the breaking developments. Trey, what are we seeing and hearing right now?
Right now, a massive barrage just fired towards southern Israel. The entire crew and I had to just dive under the car. You can hear explosions off in the distance right now. Those missile defense systems that were right next to us started firing off, trying to intercept as many rounds as possible. The soldiers that were around here also getting for any cover they can get to. This is really the heaviest clashes that we have seen along the border here. The major concern, especially for people along the border near these locations, are that when these rounds go off and they intercept rockets on a barrage like we just saw, you're seeing rockets come from every direction, and they're doing their best to try to intercept them. The major concern for that and why it can be so unsafe and why we really had to just move here in the split second of time was because they were firing rockets at all different angles. And the Iron Dome did not intercept all of them. They intercepted some of them, but we saw shrapnel raining down because when they actually explode midair, the point is to try to basically ensure that they don't land anywhere. But that shrapnel can be deadly as well. I'm just going to get up here for a second because it looks as if the barrage has stopped. Just stay with me for a second. I just need to talk to my crew. Guys, just make sure you have your flak jackets on, make sure you have your helmets on, and stay close to the edge of the car. We're fine here. Everyone's okay? You're good? Everyone's good. Okay. I just needed to check in. We were in the middle of a really major barrage there. Rockets coming in from all directions along the Israel-Gaza border. There are sirens going off all across Israel right now. And the question now is how Israel will respond to this. And I think it's important to put into context that we've been talking about this as an escalating conflict. This is the beginning steps of a war, and that is something that Israel has prepared for. It has not been formally declared, but both factions inside Gaza and the Israeli military has formally named the events that are happening this week and the back and forth clashes. And this is the heaviest fighting that the region has seen since the major operation Protective Edge back in 2014 when Israel did launch a ground operation into Gaza.
Trey, is there any indication that Israel may try to respond in real time to turn this off, or are they going to rely on Iron Dome to try to knock down as many of these missiles as possible and then go in when this barrage is over?
They're absolutely going to start responding in real time. They're likely going to start hitting the rocket launching units as they head to the border. We were in Gaza back in 2019, We were inside the Gaza Strip in November of 2019 when the Israeli military made a decision to take out a senior Islamic Jihad rocket commander by the name of Baha Abu Alata. We happened to just be there doing a feature story on border demonstrations, and a senior Hamas official invited us to cover a military parade, and it's an opportunity because when you cover factions inside Gaza, these are organizations that are deemed by the United States as terrorist groups. So having access to understand their ideology and understand why they do what they do, why they're firing rockets, why they make these decisions to launch attacks along the border and target civilians in many cases. It was an opportunity to go there and speak to militants and senior commanders and some of the people that are making statements today about this conflict. And we stayed for a few extra days, and before we were going to come out, the Israelis made a decision to launch a targeted assassination against the senior Islamic Jihad commander. At which point, 2 to 3 days of fighting erupted. Nothing like we're seeing today. That situation was much calmer than what's happening right now. But Israel made a decision to start targeting rocket launching units along the border, and that escalated things very quickly, but it also made it come to an end very quickly because the people who were trained to fire the rockets were being taken out by Israeli drones and Israeli airstrikes. Additionally, the Israelis lined up tanks so they had artillery support, and we could very likely see that even in the coming hours because the rocket barrages that are being fired towards Tel Aviv, Israel's second largest city, that's a symbol. That is a symbol for everyone involved in this conflict, and it is not a symbol that will be taken lightly. And I'm just looking off in the distance here. They're firing a few short-range rockets, but for right now, it's quiet this direction.
Obviously, do what you have to do to remain safe. Trey, if I could just ask you, going back to Benjamin Netanyahu and the speed with which he's responding to these attacks, when we saw the initial surge in rocket attacks, Netanyahu came out and said that they had done a situational assessment. His words decided that both the strengths and attacks of the attacks and the frequency of the attacks will be increased within an hour. Israel had intensified its airstrikes in and around Gaza City. The last statement that I can see that Netanyahu put out was about 4 hours ago. So to your point about how Israel will respond, I guess the question is, when will we hear from the Prime Minister about what actions will be taken next?
I wouldn't be surprised if you hear from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu tonight. There is a really uncertain political situation happening right now. Israel went to elections for the 4th time in 2 years because Netanyahu, the current prime minister, wasn't able to form a coalition government despite having the largest party here. You need 61 seats in the Israeli Knesset. So as it looked the past few days before all of this conflict erupted, his main opponent, Yair Lapid, was going to be able to put together a government with someone who would normally work with Netanyahu, a man by the name of Naftali Bennett, the former defense minister. We just spoke with Naftali Bennett before we came here, and he is one of the people who could likely be the next prime minister of Israel in a rotation. And we were at that school earlier that took rocket fire and talked to him there. And I remember speaking with him at a rocket attack a few years ago, and he said very clearly, his words exactly were, quote, "the gates of hell should open on Hamas." And I asked him tonight if he still felt that way. And he said, we need to do everything in our power to protect the citizens of Israel. And he is someone who could be the next leader of Israel. And it appears like, at least when it comes to the defense decisions that are being made right now in this country, the one thing that can bring Israeli politicians and populations together, and we're talking about a specific part of Israel, is conflict, because it is something so familiar in this region.
Yeah, so many times in Israel's history, we've seen it come together. The big war with Lebanon back in 2006, which a number of us were also at as well. Back then in 2006, they didn't have the Iron Dome protective system. We got just a few minutes ago, Trey, when you were talking, a pretty good demonstration of how that works. There was a volley of rockets that were going up for the Gaza Strip. Let's see if this happens again. And then we saw the Iron Dome rockets being fired to meet them. How
get ready to cover?
You know, if you could give us a little bit of commentary there as these rockets are going up. It doesn't look like it's as big a barrage as the last time. Trey, how effective is that Iron Dome system in terms of the percentage of rockets that it can knock down?
I spoke with a spokesperson for the Israeli military this morning, and he said so far Israel's missile defense system has been 90% effective, which is extremely positive news for the Israeli population. We talked about it a little bit yesterday during a few of our live shots, and when we were on at the top of Special Report with Brett Baer, talking about how the fact the Iron Dome exists has changed the lives for people in Israel, simply because when rockets are fired in these barrages from Gaza, they're not all landing. Many of them are being intercepted, and it's very advanced technology that other countries, including the United States, around the world are interested in, because when it comes to rocket fire, it's really some of the most advanced technology out there, because it can track and then intercept the rockets that are being fired, and it really can help a population. Off in the distance now, there are explosions, and I don't want to guess what they are. They could be impacts that are a little too far away, but they could also be interceptions like we just talked about there. When it comes down to it, during a round of conflict, the factions inside Gaza basically try to change their attack methods. Yesterday, we saw Islamic Jihad fire an anti-tank missile at a civilian car. There was a person injured inside that car. There were no casualties as a result. But you see, oftentimes, these ground operations, the issue of tunnels is not as much of a problem anymore. But rocket fire still remains the major threat for Israeli civilians. So the Iron Dome does a lot of good for that civilian population here. The civilian population that isn't as protective is the civilian population in Gaza, because oftentimes there is collateral damage, and when we press Israeli officials or military leadership about this issue, it's often a very sore subject, because during 2014 there were a lot of civilian casualties during that conflict, and it was something that Israel came under a lot of criticism for, because it's just something that is part of war. Civilian casualties. War is very messy, conflict is very messy, but there's an understanding in the international community and humanitarian law that civilians need to be protected. And as we talked about earlier, there are 2 million people inside Gaza, and most of them are not the militants firing these rockets. I've spent a lot of days in Gaza, and oftentimes when we talk about it, it can seem as if it is just this sort of hub of conflict, but there are also just people who are living there who want to go to the zoo. There's a couple of zoos in Gaza, or they want to just go about their everyday lives.
Trey, you're
rockets being fired again right now.
Yeah, we're watching. And this is something you're only seeing here on Fox News Channel. The rocket fire heard in Gaza, as you're seeing live on your screen there, as Trey reports live from the Israel-Gaza border. This conflict continues. The air raid sirens we have now heard for hours going off in Tel Aviv. Brett Baer is joining us. Speaking of Brett from Special Report, Brett, you're watching and seeing this with us. Trey's going to try to stay with us as safely as he can. But please, your thoughts on this developing moment.
Well, I think Trey's doing a great job on the ground, giving us obviously the play-by-play there is a dangerous situation. You're talking about 500 plus rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel, and I've been on that border several times. I've done interviews along that area with Israelis who, back in the day, dealt with this barrage quite frequently. It's been, we have to remember, since really 2014, since the real barrage of the rockets and the back and forth between Israel and Hamas happened. So this is a rekindling of obviously something that has gone on for decades and decades. I think the other thing we have to remember is what Trey mentioned, the political situation on the ground in Israel that is very uncertain. Currently, and how this factors into all of that, and the coalition building that has yet to happen about the next prime minister, the next government that will be seated in Israel after several attempts at getting a government to come together.
Brett, when you look back at the last really big conflict, which was the battle that Israel had with Hezbollah back in 2006, a lot of the rockets were fired up in the northern part of the country. Places like Avavim, Metula came under fire a few times. Haifa was the main target, but when Hezbollah started targeting Tel Aviv, the whole character of the conflict changed, and the response on the part of Israel really ramped up. Now that Hamas has gone beyond targeting places like Sderot, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and is now taking aim at Tel Aviv, how is that potentially going to change the nature of what's been happening over the last few days?
Well, I think it changes it dramatically, John. I think you're exactly right. And I think that the Israeli government response probably picks up exponentially. And that in turn creates this circle. You mentioned Hamas, Islamic Jihad. Go back to Hezbollah and 2006, that took on different elements of attacks, big attacks inside cities, bombings. It was really intense, and not to say that this is not, but you may see, because of the targeting of Tel Aviv, a different response from Israel.
Looking for a lawmaker response there. Obviously, condemnation from these attacks coming in the form of lawmakers, Chris Coons and others weighing in. On this moment, what could the Biden administration say? The press briefing for the day has passed to bring some sort of calm to this moment. What could we hear coming from the United States as we await Israel's response, obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu? Brett, what might we hear from the White House?
Well, I think you'll probably hear an urge for calm, an urge to mediation. The Egyptians have been attempting to mediate unsuccessfully, I should point out. Turkey, the president of Turkey is engaged, we're told, Erdogan, but so far that is not happening, and the rockets keep firing. So I assume that the Biden administration, President Biden, through a statement, likely, I would assume, a paper statement sometime calling for calm and for all sides to step down.
If this was during the Trump administration, you could imagine that the American president would have stood foursquare behind Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu. There we see the Iron Dome we were talking about going up to chase down those rockets. That's why you'll see some explosions in the sky there. Those are the Israeli rockets that are being fired up to try to intercept the Hamas rockets. But, Brett, just back to what I was saying, the last administration, President Trump would have stood fully behind Benjamin Netanyahu and likely against the Palestinians. Do you have any idea of how the tone of any statements from this administration might differ from the last?
Well, I think it would differ, John. You're exactly right. And I do think the last administration was really tight with Benjamin Netanyahu in particular and the Israelis overall. Not to say that this administration doesn't have its own relationship with Israel, but it's much different in tone and tenor. And I don't think that as far as personalities and ideology, that they are linked with Benjamin Netanyahu, and probably welcomed the fact that Lapid was going to get the nod to try to form a coalition government there. That said, I think you'll see support, and as I mentioned, probably an urge for all sides to step back.
All right, Brett, the breaking news will continue here. We'll continue to cover this live from the Israel-Gaza border. Our own Trey Yanks doing some excellent reporting there. Brett, we will see you tonight. Special report. Thank you for joining us.
You bet.
All right, up next, Senator John Kennedy on the Democrats' sweeping election push that Republicans call a...
Okay, brothers and sisters. Think about it. Getting hotter and hotter and hotter. I've been telling you for years, for months, for weeks, for days. Now we're here. My understanding of the angel, war within 60 days. Could happen any time between now and the next 60 days. Think about it. Assalamu alaikum.